Okay. All right. So I'm Arabella. This is my colleague Daisy. We work at Animal Aid, and joining us today is the brilliant Nick Jukes. Before we kick off, Nick, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit more?
Yes, thank you. So my name is Nick Jukes. I'm the coordinator of InterNICHE. That's the International Network for Humane Education.
So can you tell us about InterNICHE and what inspired its creation?
I've been involved since very close to the beginning, but not at the very first meeting. That was held in the Netherlands back in 1988 and was a gathering of students who conscientiously object to animal experiments in their education, animal welfare researchers and some other anti-vivisectionists. So it was really a gathering of people who are all concerned about harmful animal use in education and really wanting to push for the development and implementation of alternatives to bring about replacement of that animal use and enhance education at the same time.
Perfect. So going forward, I mean, you've mentioned it a bit there anyway, but going forward, that I guess are still the main goals of InterNICHE now, or do you have new initiatives that have developed over time that are different from the starting initiatives?
I think there's been a lot of change in education. We work internationally, and I think the use of technology, the development and the implementation of new technologies has really allowed for a lot of changes to happen in education. So there's been quite a lot of replacement of that harmful animal use over the years, which is really good, and a lot of new initiatives. So I think, if anything, we've probably shifted a little bit more to focusing on just how feasible and how beneficial the alternatives are, and realizing that there are many teachers behind the development of these new humane and innovative tools. Otherwise, I think, depending really on where you look, because a lot depends on country, a lot depends on individual university department, in terms of whether animals are used or alternatives are used. So I think we've also sort of looked at how the arguments for alternatives might vary according to different disciplines and according to different countries and cultures. So yeah, just a change in focus, but still there really pushing for humane education and the advantages it can bring to both students and animals.
So I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people will be aware of how animals obviously are directly used in research, but can you tell us a bit about how animals are actually used in education, and then also what some of the alternatives are that are available to us?
There's three areas really where animals might be used. One is education, which is our focus. Another big focus, of course, is research. That's finding out new knowledge. That's not something that's legally required. That's curiosity driven. And then there's testing itself, which is regulatory testing according to law, supposedly for efficacy and safety, for example, of new pharmaceutical drugs. So they're all quite different fields, really. Research and testing are really science, and education is something that's not really science in itself. It's more about gaining knowledge and skills as a student. So it's how do you learn about animal anatomy? How do you understand human physiology? How do you become an expert in clinical skills and surgery during your degree? Or not necessarily an expert, but at least become sufficiently competent, so upon graduation you have those day one competencies. So education being very much a pedagogical issue. It's all about how you gain the knowledge, how you gain and retain the skills, and do that in a very effective way, and doing that in a humane way, implementing and using innovative tools where people are really thinking about the teaching objectives and the learning outcomes. That can really sort of enhance the quality of education whilst also replacing the harmful animal use. So education is quite different from science, but of course, these are all science degrees we're talking about: biology, human medicine, and veterinary medicine. And there's a little bit at secondary school where students are doing biology, where they might face dissection or a demonstration of dissection. But our main focus is university level, degree level, life science and medical education. So within university, you have all the individual departments. anatomy, physiology, surgery, and so on. And within those different disciplines, there will be practical classes. So you have your lectures, you have your practical classes and other methods of learning. Those practical classes then may involve animals being used harmfully. And by harmful animal use, we're referring to dissection of purpose-killed animals, animal experimentation, and then other instrumental animal use. So how animals might be used as tools for something that isn't dissection and isn't an animal experiment, such as giving an injection to a horse or taking blood from a dog. So those are the areas where animals might be used harmfully. Luckily, there's been a lot of very good new initiatives for new tools and a lot of replacement that's happened. So we can often find some departments that are fully humane, occasionally whole faculties or universities, but usually it's individual departments because that's where the decisions are made for which learning tool to use. And the alternatives, really, there's quite a wide range of really good alternatives. So we're talking about non-animal tools such as models, mannequins, other simulations, virtual models using technology. So, for example, virtual anatomy programs, virtual laboratories, and then virtual reality and augmented reality. Those are the sort of non-animal models that might be used. You can also do experiments, simple non-invasive experiments on your own body. That's good for biology, it's good for medicine. It's even relevant for veterinary medicine because we're all mammals too. And this is where you might attach some electrodes to your elbow, your wrist, and give a very minor electric shock in your practical class and watch your wrist move like that. And then you can measure nerve conduction velocity. So you can actually do some physiology experiments, learning about nerve physiology and muscle physiology on your own body. You can do exercise as well. You can drink coffee and do urine analysis. So actually, self-experimentation is also a humane alternative to animal experimentation, and it's also a lot of fun, so it's going to be more memorable too. So that's another type of alternative. And then there's also humane work with animals. So for medical students, we would say don't use non-human animals at all. They should be focusing on the human body. We can have complete replacement of any animal use in medical education. But for zoology and veterinary education, of course, some students will need to have hands-on experience of living animals. So the question is, how can you do that in an ethical way? How can you replace the killing of animals for dissection or the animal experiments and still have hands-on experience with animals? Now, there's a lot of different tools, models, mannequins, and so on, and even virtual reality, where you can have a hands-on element in your practical class, even without animals. But if you need real animal tissue and real animals, maybe real living animals, the question is, how can you meet that important teaching objective? And there's really two areas here. One is, just like human body donation programs, you can have animal body donation programs. And there are either ad hoc or very formalized body donation programs in some universities where all the killing of animals for anatomy lessons, such as dissection, can be met through body donation programs. There's even a national level program within the Netherlands, for example, linking up animal protection groups, clinics where clients have to put down, sadly, their companion animal, and veterinary departments where animal bodies could be very, very useful. The key element here is that the animals were not killed for the purpose of education. They were put down because of terminal illness, an accident, or some other reason that really was for the benefit of the individual animal. So animal body donation programs can provide a replacement to the killing of animals for education. Similarly, certainly in veterinary education, every student towards the end of their degree in the clinical phase will be having clinical rotations and placements where they go and they work under supervision, helping animal patients in a clinic, a teaching hospital or sometimes an independent or private clinic. And then they're working in a therapeutic environment, helping the individual animals, learning skills under supervision and being allowed to gradually perform minor necessary procedures for those animals and gain those skills in a situation that involves real living animals. But it's a healing, not a harming environment. So we call body donation programs and clinical learning opportunities alternatives to harmful animal use as well. But for many people, the alternatives are the non-animal models. However, both areas, both groups of tools and approach can also bring about that replacement. So we have the non-animal models, we have the body donation programs and clinical learning opportunities, and then you can also get out into the field. So if you're a biology student, get out of the lab for once, get out into the field, observe animals in their natural habitat, observe stray animals in the cities, and all of that can also be an alternative to an animal experiment. So there's a lot of really good creative options that have been developed. Some of these are traditions that have been going on for quite a long time. I mean, models have been used for centuries within education, and veterinary education in the UK is generally quite humane. A lot of focus on models and mannequins and clinical learning opportunities with patients. But that's not the case in every department. It's not the case in every country. So there's still a lot of change that needs to happen. But certainly we can celebrate what's been achieved already.
Absolutely. So how do those modern technologies that you did mention, like the virtual simulations, mannequins, and non-animal training models, like how do they compare to the traditional animal-based models?
There have been some studies that directly compare one alternative or one non-animal model with one practical class that might involve killing or experimenting on an animal. And the results show that students learn equally or better with the alternatives. However, I would say that there's not only a need for more studies, but to factor in the reality that often a number of different tools will be used in one or more practical classes. So often you use a combination of lectures, practical class that involves a model, some software, and then applying that either in the clinical phase of education or in some other area on yourself as student self-experimentation. Every student is different and has different learning styles. So using a combination of different tools, a range of different tools, often can allow the education to be more inclusive and more accessible. So when you're really using a number of different tools and approaches, there's a chance to not only meet standard teaching objectives more effectively, but you have a chance to meet new objectives too. So, for example, if you're learning, say, canine anatomy, you could be using, instead of just using a dog that's been killed and you dissect it, causing stress and maybe trauma to the student, to say nothing of the killing of the dog, then you've got quite a limited way of learning, really. You might not be able to do everything yourself. You might wonder why you're doing it. It might be against your deeply held moral or religious principles. And you may well know that there are other ways that other universities use very successfully. So when you're using the software first, you'll be able to understand the different structures within the body, how they all relate, the spatial relationship, to go back and forth within the software till you've really learnt something, till you and your supervisor, your teacher, is satisfied that you really understand something. You can bring in other species for comparative anatomy into the software, and you can look at microanatomy, the histology, and zoom out to the gross anatomy too. So you've got really all the power of technology helping you learn. You can apply that onto a model, which might be a plastic or wooden model with or without labels, dissectable by taking all the different parts off, and rebuildable too. And then you've got the training models and mannequins too, where you might apply that anatomical knowledge. And then you've got ethically sourced animal cadavers you could use in your class, and finally working with animal patients. So all of these together really show how you're actually going to learn much more effectively your standard teaching objectives. The additional objectives you might be able to gain are things where you might not even be able to do with an animal experiment, but good software, good models, good creative thinking about what you're really trying to achieve. What are the teaching objectives? And it's important to be really clear on that and to recognise that they develop over time according to the demands of society and the professions. Then you start to think, okay, what else can we do? So you could, for example, study the effects of the heart at its limits that you couldn't do in any other way when you use a virtual laboratory. You could practice not only how to really master a specific operation, let's say intestinal anastomosis within a dog. So this is where a dog might have swallowed a dice and or a toy, and you have to do an operation. You go to the vets. How did that vet learn? Did that vet learn well by practicing with software, with models, with mannequins? Did they have a chance to really keep on practicing till they'd mastered that skill? And have that supervised, of course, by professionals who really know what they're doing? Or did they just get a random animal experiment, the same as has always been done, which hasn't really ever been validated as a good working approach in terms of how well to meet those teaching objectives? So you can do a lot more. You can also, for example, introduce in a practical class an emergency scenario. So you surprise the student with an emergency, but within a controlled environment that doesn't involve any animal harm. And then the students have to learn how to manage stress, not only identifying a bleeding vessel within the abdomen, for example, a synthetic vessel within a synthetic abdomen, but often very advanced model, but then they have to deal with the stress of dealing with panic, dealing with the pressure. And by doing that in a safe environment in the training, when they then work with animals in the clinic in their degree, and then in clinics and hospitals after they've graduated, they're going to be better prepared. They've been through those emotions, they've been through those scenarios, and actually they're going to be better trained. So this is an example of where the students have done something they could not have done with the animal experiment because of the advanced mannequins, maybe linked to software, creating an emergency scenario with the heartbeat going up, with the blood pressure dropping, and so on. You can do all that as well. So in multiple ways, the students can learn better. And that's really exciting. It's not only a great benefit to the animals, it's a great benefit to the students and the professions too.
Amazing. That was very interesting. So do you think these learning institutions and universities are becoming more open to adopting these alternative methods, or is there resistance in any way, do you think?
There's a lot of departments where the alternatives are already the norm. In fact, many teachers won't even be calling them alternatives because they're just standard tools that are doing a better job. And they've introduced them because maybe they've developed the tools themselves and realized that actually students need a lot more hands-on experience, especially in clinical skills and surgery for medical students and veterinary students, but also throughout all of the different degrees where animals might have been used harmfully. So often it's the teachers behind the change. There's so many products that are also on the market. So not only have teachers developed their own models, but some have then marketed them, or companies produce and market them. And these are increasingly widely being used. So these are often typically, So these are often the typical way of learning now, which is really quite exciting. I think also teachers realise that when you assess a course and think about what you're really trying to teach and what students need to be learning, then there's a more sort of considered approach to what you're trying to do and what the best ways of learning might be. So it's more reflective on the nature of education. It's more open. It reflects an openness to what exists in the market, where other places have already implemented these tools. And also it's often more effective in terms of students learning. Growing class sizes, you can manage better when you've got distributed software, for example, and a chance for students to access the skills lab to practice and practice and practice again. And so ultimately it means the students are going to graduate with more knowledge and more skills, and that's in the interest of the universities too.
Mm-hmm. So, what are the biggest challenges you face in advocating for the replacement of animal use, whether it's dissection or otherwise, in education?
I think many teachers are very busy. I think that the thought of having to change your curriculum is often a bit much in terms of all the other demands that teachers face. But I think what's important to remember is that it's exactly the same knowledge and it's the same skills, perhaps with some extra skills added, that the alternatives can allow you to teach and learn. So I think that the shift really from harmful animal use to alternatives is not so immense, and sometimes that change can happen overnight. Software teaching the same thing as the animal experiment, is something that can really be changed overnight. And when you have lots of computer labs, that's not a totally global thing, but increasingly it's heading in that direction, then you can bring about the replacement very quickly. In other cases, you might need to wait to the next term or the next year when you've really thought about more structural changes within the curriculum. But there is an attachment, of course, to traditional methods, conventional methods. I was taught this way, so I'll teach my students in the same way. But I think when you really start to think about teaching objectives, start to think about what other universities are doing with great success, then it's a question really then of being open to new ways of doing things, using new tools. And really, this is a bit similar to a research project. You look at the way you're doing things, you think if there's any other approach, whether there's some good evidence that other ways might be better, and then you can readjust your curriculum in the same way.
One of the things you mentioned there was like how busy teachers are. I think that does make sense as being quite a reason for it. And I guess, like you said, people seem to be quite positive towards it, but there might be things getting in the way. I mean, have you got any success?
Can I mention cost? I think cost is quite a big thing here. So sometimes for the really advanced mannequins or some virtual reality models, the cost might be relatively high. But we've got to remember that animal experiments cost money. To buy the animals, to have the same lab, the staff to manage things, it takes money. And the alternatives are often a real investment, either a capital investment where you're going to see the returns very soon in terms of enhanced skills, enhanced knowledge acquisition. Also, some software can be really inexpensive and occasionally free. There's freeware. A body donation program for ethically sourced animals, there are some minor costs, but you're using a resource that exists already. So sometimes these alternatives are free. Other times they're of low or medium cost and occasionally high cost. But even then, the benefits are so great that it's really worth the investment. Similarly with computers, not every university across the world has widespread access for students in terms of computers, but things are moving in that way, and I think that software can become a very good alternative even in those countries too. The other aspect in terms of teaching objectives is looking at what we call the hidden curriculum, and this is the implicit and usually negative messages that a certain learning tool or approach might present to students. It might say that doing animal experiments and becoming desensitized, erasing your compassion and your empathy is an important thing to do. But in fact, that's really not true. Empathy and compassion are crucial for us as individuals, are crucial within society, and are certainly important if you're going to be working with animals or people in the future. So becoming desensitized is something that we need to really avoid. Mm-hmm. Of course, you need to manage surgery to be able to think rationally and focus on your technical skills. So you might briefly suspend your emotional aspect while you're doing an operation, but then you bring it back afterwards because you need to ensure that a patient has the best recovery and post-operative care. So the interplay between sort of the cerebral, the technical skills on the one hand, and emotional literacy, your compassion and your empathy, is quite an interesting dynamic. But it's also really important, I think, to remember that we need to stay sensitive, compassionate, and empathic, as well as stay critically thinking. And the alternatives can really help you in all those ways as well. And they'll help you obviate or remove these lessons of the hidden curriculum too.
Amazing. So do you have any stories where InterNICHE have successfully helped an institution transition away from using animals for dissection or otherwise?
No. We haven't done anything. No, I'm joking. Okay, so part of what we do is to produce resources to help teachers make the step towards humane education, towards replacement. So there's information resources, there's case studies we can show, and so on. That's really important. We also do a lot of outreach across the world. I've been everywhere from Peru to Iran to Australia, promoting the alternatives, giving teachers a chance to try them out in exhibitions, for example. But we're also working directly with teachers to try to bring about change in specific departments. So, for example, along with our Ukrainian national contact and colleagues at an animal protection group in Germany, we've been signing agreements with individual departments at universities across the Ukraine, also Russia and Belarus and Kyrgyzstan, to directly replace their animal experiments, or sometimes their dissections too. We then give them software, maybe a projector, some reconditioned laptops as an investment in the change, and they agree to end all animal experiments or to never go back to them if they've already replaced them. And that's important. I think now, over the years, the annual use of over 50,000 animals is no longer happening. So every year that goes past, over 50,000 animals are not being used. So the replacement not only brings about change at that time in that year, it also ensures that in all future years, the teaching is going to be humane. So it's a very important So it's a very important change. I think we need to recognise the impact of a humane education. We're also working along with many others in India to promote the alternatives and help get change there. So some years ago, the University Grants Commission, the UGC in India, which is a centralised body that helps define the curriculum within biology, first discouraged and then banned the use of dissection in zoology practical classes at university. Now, India is a huge country. There are a lot of universities and colleges where animals were killed for dissection, caught from the wild or bred and then used for dissection. With that ended, it's estimated that something like 10 to 20 million animals are no longer being used in zoology dissection classes. So in India, things are very centralized. So when you get change at the center, the impact is very broad across the whole country. In many other countries, it depends on individual teachers in individual departments to make that change. So that's a couple of examples. I want to think of some others. There are also lots of other changes that I'm sure have happened that we're not aware about. Sometimes we find out later that a new veterinary college, for example, that was given a range of software by us in the past, never developed animal experiments in its new curriculum because they had some of the alternatives and because they were exposed to them to then bought or develop their own afterwards. So there's a lot of change that might have happened that we're unaware of, and it's quite exciting to find out later that you've played a role in avoiding harmful animal use even being established in the first place at a new college, for example.
Definitely. So how would InterNICHE respond to those who say that using animals in research or in dissections are necessary evil, even though there are obviously all of these humane alternatives?
I think knowing that full replacement is feasible and desirable, so it's been achieved. There are lots of case studies, lots of examples, and the published studies show that actually students are learning equally or better in each of these cases, really shows that it's something that is not necessary at all. I think those examples and those case studies really show that it's not necessary to be using animals harmfully. Not only can you have access to animal bodies for dissection from a body donation program, and work with virtual anatomy programs and models to really meet and exceed your standard anatomy teaching objectives, but you can do so much more. These new technologies, these new tools are very clearly better than using conventional methods. The harmful animal use also teaches you something negative, that your moral position, your religious position doesn't matter, that new technology shouldn't be available to you as a student with all its benefits, that teaching objectives are not really being thought about very clearly, so that students somehow lose out on their education. So I wouldn't say it's a necessarily evil at all. I'd just say it is a problem, and the alternatives can do so much of a better job, and the examples around the world really demonstrate that clearly. Within research and testing too, I think the new knowledge and the new technologies can provide so much in terms of better research, more relevant research, and more effective testing, that the replacement is increasingly growing in this area too, from organs on a chip and organoids to the use of AI for big data management. All of these methods and good use of new technologies are really helping, I think, make the research and the testing much better in terms of developing new drugs for people and also for animals, and in terms of ensuring their efficacy and safety and relevance. When you're looking for developing drugs for humans, and you're using human tissue or you're using human data rather than that based on animal experiments that were never validated in the first place, then I think it's very clearly something that's in the interests of people, in the interests of patients, in the interests of society itself. So I think there's a lot of excitement about the new technologies and how beneficial they can be in terms of efficacy and safety. And it's a rapidly growing field, whether it's the organs on a chip or AI. Things are changing by the month. So it's quite an exciting time to see how this new technology is being applied now and will be applied in the future. I think one challenge is that regulators are often quite behind in terms of what the new knowledge and technologies are, and laws similarly don't necessarily reflect the latest knowledge and technologies. So there's an issue there with training the regulators, with informing them, for them to see that, yes, the studies show that you can have more effective results, more relevant results when you use these innovative, these humane, innovative tools.
Great. And what would you say to the students themselves, or maybe even researchers who, they feel uncomfortable using animals, but they actually kind of fear that speaking out could harm their studies or even harm their career? I think particularly for students, when you might be in a more vulnerable situation and sometimes you focus on just wanting to pass the course or impress lecturers, people of authority, what would you say to those individuals who do feel uncomfortable?
Some students have access to alternatives and they're not presented or pressured into doing animal experiments or dissection of purpose-killed animals, and that's really good. I think they get a better education and it's fully humane. Everyone benefits. But when there is harmful animal use, I would say that a lot of students feel uncomfortable with it, but don't necessarily feel able to speak up. I think it's very important to voice your opinion. I think this is a sign of being in touch with your empathy, your compassion, your sensitivity. And it's also a reflection of critical thinking. And it's very important not to lose those qualities, those skills. So do reflect on the situation, do speak up. You can do that in a very respectful way, talking to your course supervisor, talking to the head of department. Say that you're aware of the alternatives, you're aware of the case studies, you're aware of the published academic studies that compare harmful animal use with alternatives, and you'd like to have access to those yourself. Now, of course, we would argue that it's much better if all the students have access to those tools, and that's something definitely to be aimed for. And some students who have more overtly, conscientiously objected to harmful animal use have helped achieve that within a certain department or within their whole faculty or university. So sometimes it takes one person to stand up, to gather colleagues, to present a reasoned argument of why replacement could and should happen, and then the change can spread out from there into the university and beyond. So there's some very exciting examples of where people have achieved change. Other times things can be quite difficult. I know there was a US student who was refused alternatives despite her freedom of conscience arguments, as well as the practical arguments too. And she ended up, because the university wasn't responsive, taking her university to court. And in fact, she won the case, and $95,000 compensation for her freedom of conscience being violated. But of course, it's much better to have cooperative, collaborative discussions and change being achieved between students and teachers, and avoid legal action or avoid negative media exposure, because really it's in the interests of students, teachers and animals, as well as the professions, for that replacement to happen. So I'd say to students, stick to your principles, question things. This is all a good investment anyway in terms of working in science or as a clinician in the future. But I'd also say to teachers that you can teach the same things. All your knowledge and your skills can be passed on more effectively when you use the alternatives. The only change is the tool or the approach you're using. So it's really to everyone's benefit. Right. Sometimes teachers who use animal experiments in their teaching might also be doing animal experiments at university in their research work as well. So they have a sort of investment and bias in terms of which tool might be used, because they might not want to change their practice in research, and they might want their students to come into their research field with them later on. So there's an interesting intersection there with what students are doing and what the researchers are doing. So I think we need to be aware that there is this sort of investment in some practices continuing. But I think we can also look at education changing and separately look at research changing. I think all areas could change for the better. That's obvious. Everything can be better if we put our mind to it. So it's important, I think, to think about the different areas where that could change.
Leads on to my next question, which is about that relationship. I think we spoke a bit earlier about the difference between humane education and humane science. But what is that relationship between the two? Perhaps you could speak a little bit about that for us.
Sure. Let me just briefly say about researchers and people in testing making changes too, and the reluctance there. Then remind me of the question, just because that's the second part of your previous question. I think it's also sometimes a challenge for people within research or doing testing as well to make changes too. Sometimes the whole lab is established for doing animal experiments. A lot of the data is based on animal experiments. But I think the important thing is to say, what are we really trying to achieve here? Just like in education, what we're trying to do is to better meet teaching objectives. So what are the tools to enable you to do that? In research and testing, it's a similar thing. What are you trying to achieve? You're trying to get knowledge that's more appropriate and relevant faster and better. You're trying to do the job of testing of efficacy and safety for a new drug, for example, more effectively. So how do you do that? Well, you've got to look at the latest technologies. You've got to look at the studies to see what methods work best. And then even if you have an investment in a lab, in old data and so on, you can say to yourself, well, things are not working well enough. We need to make some changes here. The good thing is that the alternatives in research and testing are often much more cost effective. There was a study comparing drug development using animal experiments and using AI recently, and the AI method enabled the results, the predictivity, to be achieved not only to a greater degree with 10% or more increased predictivity, but also at a fraction of the cost, which is really, really important, and in a fraction of the time, which is also related to the cost. This was an AI method looking back on the development of a tool. So really, this is, I think, is one reason why even the big pharmaceutical companies are investing in alternatives bit by bit, stage by stage, not only with non-animal models like organoids, but also with AI, because they know they can get a drug onto the market so much faster and have likely much better data in terms of relevance, efficacy, safety. So I think it's quite an exciting time within research and testing too.
Right.
Okay, that was that little bit there. And then going back to your question, the connection.
Yes.
I think when students have a humane education and have had a chance to use a range of different alternatives, not only are they learning, gaining knowledge better and gaining their skills better, but they're being exposed to other ways of doing things. They're being exposed to a range of different tools. And that exposure, that familiarity, is really important in terms of what they then might be open to within science, within research and testing. So they know about some alternatives. It's not all the same alternatives, but they know about other ways of doing things, about the developments in non-animal technologies. So they're more likely to be open to the growing field of innovation within research and testing too. And the software and the chance to practice again and again and to repeat their skills acquisition on other non-animal models means that they're going to be better trained, both in terms of knowledge and skills. So they're going to be better professionals. That includes critical thinking. Okay, the tools are often developed to encourage your critical thinking, software where you can go backwards and forwards until you've really understood principles and their application. So you're going to be a better graduate when you've used alternatives. You're going to have had more experience in this area. You're going to be better prepared for going into humane science. And there's a lot of opportunities now within humane science, because the fields of non-animal research and non-animal testing now are growing so rapidly. There's so many new technological developments and innovations that I think every student can be happy to know that there are career opportunities in these fields. You don't have to go into animal experimentation if you want to be a researcher or work in regulation. There are really so many opportunities now. There's still a lot of change to happen. There's still a lot of new innovations that will happen, but it's a growing field. And I think that's quite exciting, both for the professions, but also the students who may well go into those fields afterwards. So, yeah, I think humane education really helps smooth the path towards a humane science. If you don't have humane education, of course, you get people who did animal experiments in their education and then went into animal experiments in science and then changed when they realized that actually these weren't very good approaches. They weren't a gold standard after all. Things were a little bit rusty, a little bit tarnished. So some scientists and people working in technology may well change because they see the limitations of animal experimentation in those fields. But if you've been prepared as a student in terms of being familiar with alternatives, in terms of learning through the use of alternatives, you're more likely and more rapidly going to go into humane science. You might also not go into research and testing. You might want to go into becoming a clinician, but you'll be better trained for that purpose too.
Great. Well, if thinking about that and building on it a little bit, is there any kind of practical, specific advice you'd give to those students who find themselves in that position where they do want to forge a career in science, but maybe they don't want to work in experimentation, they don't want to be a researcher, but thinking about those different pathways that are open to them? Are there any practical tips or things you would say to a student in that position?
I think be aware of the growing fields of humane research and humane testing and how things really are changing, largely driven by the science and the technology and the advantages that these can bring, but also supported by all the pressure from animal protection organisations and others who have been pushing for alternatives for a very long time. So I think students often don't have a chance to really discuss animal welfare, to discuss ethics or bioethics, and also to learn about non-animal methods or NAMs in research and testing during their degree. So I think it's important also for there to be courses about NAMs within their education. So not only learning through the use of alternatives, but learning a little bit about NAMs in research and testing and what the developments and the progress are. So I think pushing for those courses to be integrated into your degree, looking for opportunities for summer schools and other education and training about NAMs in research and testing would also be good. And just looking online with a lot of the organisations, a lot of the databases, a lot of the networks where people are sharing information about the advantages and the implementation of alternatives or NAMs within research and testing is important.
No, I think that's really helpful. I think it's really helpful. And kind of bringing everything together, I guess, finally, are there any upcoming projects or developments from InterNICHE that you're particularly excited about? And also, how do you see that the things you're working on right now fitting within the kind of future of humane science and education?
So we've launched one episode of our veterinary education documentary film series, and this looks at advanced surgery, primarily looking at abdominal surgery of the dog, which is something that every veterinary student needs to become proficient at. So that's on our website at interniche.org. And what we've done is look at case studies of where these tools are already implemented, and the teachers can talk about the advantages of these tools. The other episodes that are forthcoming within that film series will look at all the other disciplines, the anatomy, the physiology, the basic clinical skills and surgery, as well as the clinical learning opportunities with animal patients that veterinary students will do at the end of their degree. So what we wanted to present is really the full trajectory within a veterinary degree, illustrating how every teaching objective within every discipline can indeed be better met using individual and combinations of non-animal tools and clinical learning opportunities. Later on, we'd like to work with a case studies book, looking all around the world, not only veterinary education, but also medical education and training and biology degrees, and touching a little bit on secondary level and continuing education within the professions too, perhaps touching on research and testing, the education and training aspects with regard to how replacement in that area can also be enhanced, but keeping to our main focus of university level degrees and how students learn in practical classes. I think the film series and a book, and perhaps other film series in the future, can together provide some powerful resources, including in translation into other languages, that can illustrate by example, including some of the best universities in the world, that these tools are already the norm. These humane tools are the standard way of teaching, and where the harmful animal use continues, we really can add pressure by example for replacement of that practice to happen, again, to everyone's benefit. The students benefit because they have better teaching tools available to learn in a more effective way. The teachers benefit because they can pass on their knowledge and their skills more effectively. The professions and society benefit because the students will graduate and enter those areas with more skills and better retention of knowledge. And of course, the animals benefit. They're either not being killed for dissection, or they're not being experimented on, and that really is their right.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our questions. That was so amazing and informative.
I think that was a great note to finish on as well.
Yeah,
thinking about the future of humane education and science, and the positive steps we've taken is brilliant.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick.
That's all right. That's all right.